All of our institutions have now been captured by this liberal woke elite. Well, we have to understand, actually, and this is one of the key messages that I try to impart at almost every opportunity, is that Britain is now a post-revolutionary society. This is a clear and deliberate attempt to try to erase and rewrite our history, but also to make us ashamed of who we are as a people, to make you to be ashamed of being British. This is right out of the communist playbook. I think everybody owes Tommy Robinson a huge debt if this is proven to be true, and if it's proven that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, and or the Home Secretary knew in advance of decrying the patriotic people who were concerned about the murder of 3 young girls and denounced them as thugs and far right and criminals, if they knew in advance.
So today we welcome a very special guest to the show. That is Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Many of you will know Rafe from his appearances on GB News and Talk TV, and I'm delighted to welcome him onto the show today for the first time. So Rafe, a very warm welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, much appreciated. I'm sure that most of my viewers will be fully aware of who you are and what you do, but for those that aren't, just give us a quick introduction.
Right, it was a great pleasure to be with you, Paul. And firstly, I just want to say, congratulations for everything you're doing and for your patriotism.
Thank you.
It's so fundamentally important that we have, as many voices as we can right now. And if there's going, we are in a sort of a civilizational, cultural battle, and the only hope of victory is if we all do mobilize. And so, bravo for standing up for the English and for the British people. I'm a historian dealing and specializing in British identity, British institutions, everything from the monarchy to our government to our national symbols. Everything that essentially we identify as being iconically British and how they evolved and why we have them the way that they are. And also, I'm a royal ceremonial commentator. I have been since the death of Diana, so I deal with all the great state occasions, funerals, coronations, Remembrance Sunday, all that sort of stuff. And also, I'm a cultural warrior as well. I'm a senior fellow at the New Culture Forum, which has much synergy with a lot of what you're doing, and I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with our channel, where we have conferences as well that we organize, and lectures, and write books and chapters and things on various issues, which I'm sure are close to the heart of many of your viewers.
So a busy man. Just a bit.
We live in interesting times, and so that makes us busy. I'm far busier than I'd like to be.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned culture there, and that's a word that instantly comes up in a lot of people's minds. What's happened to our culture over the last few years, and when did this very noticeable change begin for you?
Well, we have to understand, actually, and this is one of the key messages that I try to impart at almost every opportunity, is that Britain is now a post-revolutionary society. We've already had the revolution, and we are now actually the counter-revolutionaries. That's why we're having these discussions on YouTube and on your platform rather than on mainstream media, because the mainstream media, our universities, our government, sadly, all of our institutions have now been captured by this liberal woke elite. This has been a top-down revolution. Not all. All revolutions are essentially an organized minority taking control over a disorganized majority, and we have been until now, and until things like you're doing as well. We're now finally getting organized, but we need to understand it in that context, that the nation may, our institutions may look the same, but you don't need to have mobs in the streets and red flags on rooftops to have a revolution. The buildings look the same, but the people who run our institutions are cuckoos in the nest who bear no comparison to those people that built those institutions and who ran them until relatively recently. That's why we have a topsy-turvy culture now, in which black is white and up is down, and everything we once held dear is now undermined. This is a clear and deliberate attempt to try to erase and rewrite our history, but also to make us ashamed of who we are as a people, to make you to be ashamed of being British. You know, if you read any of the publications coming out now, there is simply nothing that the British people have to be proud about. Whereas, of course, in fact, we know that Britain created the modern world around us. No country has had a bigger impact on the modern world than we have had, you know, from the Industrial Revolution to the spread of the English language. And, you know, we didn't invent capitalism, but it was the British Empire that spread capitalism globally, and nothing has done more to lift the world out of poverty and to raise the world than capitalism and the British Empire. And all of that's been erased. And why is that? Because the way that you have a revolution is by removing the connection between a people and their sense of identity and their sense of place. So by eroding British culture, you make it far easier to supplant it with a new ideology, with a new myth. You know, this is right out of the communist playbook. It's year zero sort of a thing, pulling down of statues, renaming streets. This is all a way to essentially demoralize a society. And once you demoralize a society, and once you then indoctrinate an entire generation of young people, as we've seen over the last 20, 25 years, it then becomes very easy to create these new foundational myths. All cultures have foundational myths. You know, I'm here in London, and here the old medieval myth was that this was founded by King Lud and by Gog and Magog, you know, these mythical things. Now you've got just as crazy myths that, you know, Sadiq Khan keeps saying that diversity built London, immigration built London, a complete slur and slander on all those generations of Britons who built St. Paul's Cathedral and the Houses of Parliament and so forth. Even had our former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, minting a 50p coin saying diversity built Britain, even though Britain has never been diverse until the last few decades. So this is when culture has been changing. I mean, this has been a long process. I don't know how much time you want to go into it, but we could discuss it later if you want to. But this goes back essentially, you know, 100 years more or less. It's been slowly burning, but ever since the 1960s, it's really taken over what this chap called Rudi Deutschke said in America: the long march through the institutions, a very slow, gradual capture of the academic institutions, the cultural institutions that shape a nation's beliefs and thoughts. And that's why we've seen this left-wing capture, but it's really gone on steroids in the last 10 years.
Yeah, we kind of walked into it in many ways, I feel. And, you know, it starts off at the schools. I have grandchildren. I speak to them about what they're being taught. More importantly, what they're not being taught at school. But I think for me, one of the things on my mind is that our tolerance is partly responsible for our downfalls to getting where we are now. We're forever told that we need to be more tolerant. But look where tolerance has got us. It's not in a good place.
You're absolutely right. And, you know, the English, the British are supremely tolerant. And it's quite remarkable to look at Ireland, for example. Now, you know, we've endured mass immigration to this country for a quarter of a century. And we've done it essentially in a placid manner. The Irish have only had it for a couple of years, and they're already rioting. You look to France and Greece and so forth. The English and the British are famous for their tolerance, and it gets to a point, unfortunately, where it does begin to become a negative. And I mean, people are now actually, I think there's a degree of intolerance now increasing in Britain, quite simply because people realize that these things can't carry on. And if you take a tolerant people, but you tell that tolerant group of people that they are racist, that they are misogynistic, that they're homophobic, that they have systemic racism, they have white privilege, even those tolerant people will say, look, enough is enough. Because by every standard, Britain is actually one of the world's most tolerant and least racist countries. There's an annual survey called the World Values Survey, which is conducted by universities around the world. Universities not known for being very right-wing, and they conduct the very basic test. How would you feel if somebody of a different race lived next door to you? And Britain ranks number 3 and has consistently, behind only Sweden and Brazil, as the world's 3rd least racist country. You know, the most racist is India. Following shortly behind that, various African states, then you look towards China and Japan and so forth. There is a reason why that you have such large numbers of the world coming to Europe, because it is such a tolerant place. But even within the European Union, they had a survey out before Brexit that showed that Britain was actually the least racist country in Europe, although actually Malta came first. We were second to Malta for some strange reason. And yet, of course, if you ask the children of today, and this is what's most remarkable, if you ask, we've got the evidence for this now, what the number one issue is affecting Britain as far as young people are concerned, you might think they would say, oh, it's climate change or something like that. It's racism. Despite all of the evidence to the contrary, there is nowhere else you could possibly go and be better if you were a black person. They think it's racism. That's how far the indoctrination has gone in.
Let's go on to Keir Starmer and his Labour government, because I could have you all day if I'm not careful. But, look, he's been in charge for a few months now, if you can call it in charge. What do you make of his initial few months?
All I can say is, my God, we've got 5 years of this to come. Just look at the car crash. Look at the agenda that we've seen within such a short space of time. I'm old enough to remember the film The Fly from the 1980s with Jeff Goldblum. Be afraid, be very afraid. And I'm afraid, that the revolution that was ushered in by Tony Blair has come of age under Keir Starmer. Blair was the most dangerous prime minister we've ever had. The constitutional change, the social structural change, the institutional change he brought in was truly revolutionary, but it takes a while for the mechanisms to all click into place. And the great calamity, the great disaster, something we should never forgive the Conservatives for, is they were in power for longer than Tony Blair was, and they did nothing to try to reverse that. Because if they had eliminated Tony Blair's Human Rights Act, repealed Tony Blair's Equalities Act, done all of those sorts of things to actually recapture our institutions, we would not be in a bad place if Starmer took over now. But all of the apparatus was still there, and it grew over the last 20 years. And Starmer is now using that machine to extreme effect. And of course, that the left understand very well how to control a society is by taking over the levers of power, because although the Tories never cancelled any Labour legislation, as soon as Labour got in, what was one of the first things they did? Is they struck down the free speech in higher education bill, a very important bill for academic freedom, guaranteeing free speech at universities. They know full well how to win these culture wars, and we don't. And that's one of the reasons we should be very afraid. I think this is a far more damaging leader than you could have expected, even under say a Jeremy Corbyn, because he does this all slyly. You can be a Marxist, but if you wear a nice suit, a suit's paid for by somebody else, people don't realize quite how draconian and authoritarian you are. And I don't think we've had such an authoritarian prime minister ever, because quite remember, this man is not a politician. He is a prosecutor. He came to politics very late in life, in his 50s. His entire way of thinking is about legislation and laws and punishment. This is how he thinks, and that's how he views us all. That's why you saw him coming down so harsh, for example, in the Southport riots.
I was going to ask you about that. I wanted to ask you about that, Southport, the riots, and some of the sentencing that went on. They're supposed to be separate, the judiciary and but do you think there was an influence from Starmer? There had to have been, right?
Absolutely. We talk about two-tier policing. We have a two-tier Britain. We've got two-tier media. We have a two-tier justice system. I'm sure many other of your guests have spoken about, the distinction between how, the Palestine protest marches are policed compared to how these things were policed, when you had even the Sarah Everard protest vigil in Clapham Common. There were more arrests there for those poor women protesting the murder of that girl than there were. You've had EDL marches, which had, 1/10 or 1/20th of the number of people. They had more arrests taking place there. I think a large part of it, of course, is that not only do our police buy into a lot of this and have sympathy with it, they just don't think any longer that they can handle such large numbers of Muslim protesters, and that's the sad reality. I mean, lots of people say, for example, that it's only a tiny minority of Muslims and so forth who protest on these things. But the reality is, it's a very large minority. It's a huge minority, and there are 400,000 people in this country who identify as fundamental Muslim terrorist supporters. That's 400,000 people. It's not by no means all Muslims at all. But it's a very large number. Yeah. And the police, I think, understand now that policing that sort of an environment is so incendiary that they're taking a step back.
That's really frightening to think that you've just said out loud what I think a lot of us think, that they're scared. And that's a very frightening prospect for the future of this country and for everyone's safety. I mean, how do we change that, Rafe? How do we get around this problem?
So they're scared, but also they can't admit it, because if they admit the reality of what's going on, then they have to admit the part that they played in allowing this, because the warning signs have been on the wall for decades. Ever since Salman Rushdie, we have known about the dark dangers and threat from the Islamist world, and yet we have had an open door policy allowing in the very people to come in from the most culturally incompatible nations to a degree you don't see in a place like, for example, Canada. Canada now has a big mass immigration policy as well. But for years, people said, oh, well, look, Canada is a shining example of how immigration works. Yes, because they were cherry picking the the PhD candidates, the engineers, the people were going that were coming from very, very sort of, studied and successful backgrounds. We have just essentially opened the door to all of the flotsam and jetsam of the world. And it's not surprising, therefore, that the issue we have with Islamic integration here is far worse than anywhere else. For example, 81% of British Muslims identify as being Muslim first and British second. It's only 60-odd% in France, right? So we have a very severe issue here. 15% of Muslims in this country sympathize with Islamic terrorism and extremism. It's only around 8% in Germany. So there is something very distinct about the type of people we've let into this country compared to elsewhere, and the complete failure to integrate them. And of course, all of this rests upon the inability of our governments, of our police, of all of our institutions to understand or be willing to recognize this. Why? Because they were petrified by political correctness. That's why we had for years the mass industrial scale rape of young girls everywhere from Rotherham to Oldham in leafy Oxfordshire to go below the radar, despite people knowing exactly what was going on. Social services knew, the councils knew, the police knew, and they allowed it because they put alleged social cohesion above the lives of young British girls, and also Hindu and Sikh girls as well, it must be said as well. Now, people like that no one has been sent to prison or charged. They should be charged and punished severely. Not only lose their jobs, lose their pensions for what I would call it the biggest scandal of the 21st century.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I just want to touch on someone else for the moment. I mean, look, one of the people that was heavily responsible for outing these gangs and for revealing what they were getting up to is currently sitting in jail. That's Tommy, obviously. What's your views on Tommy and the fact that he's in prison right now?
I think everybody owes Tommy Robinson a huge debt for his ability to focus attention on, as I said, the rape gangs, the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs. I think he did a stellar service there to shake people out of their complacency and wake them up to, as I said, something that is the greatest scandal of our time. I think he has been subjected to vile calumnies, the accusations of racism, for example. I've seen no evidence of this. You just have to also look at some of his friends who are from the Sikh community and so forth. This is all about a battle against culture and ideology. This is not an attack on brown-skinned people, because there's nothing that he said is opposed to Muslim individuals or to the Indians or anything like that. This is about the ideology of Islam, and it's misogynistic and it's backwards and it's abhorrent cultural practice. It's everything from honor killings, acid attacks, female genital mutilation. Well, not female genital mutilation so much in that part of the world. That's more a Muslim African sort of a thing. But the point is, it's the culture rather than the race. And people need to understand when we discuss these things, we're not talking about the race of people. We're talking about the cultural practices that they have been born into,
and the ideology,
and they bring over here, and the ideology. Now, personally, I don't think it was very sensible of Tommy Robinson to play that film, knowing it was in contempt of court. I think it was obvious what was going to happen. So I personally think he could have thought better about that, and I don't think he needed to have been in jail if he hadn't done that. But he made his decision to do that, and that was his choice. I personally don't think that was necessary, and he wouldn't be in jail had he not done that.
Speaking to him before the event when he played that film, I think the advice from people that were close to him was that you don't have to show the film. Many people have already seen it, but I think his attitude towards it was, like, if I have to make this sacrifice, I'm prepared to make it. And I think that's something that, whether you like him or whether you don't, you got to admire his spirit.
Look, if that's how he views things, I'm more worried about him in prison, right? So I don't know whether it's worth, is the sacrifice worth that much? The number of people who were there in Trafalgar Square would probably have already seen it anyway. You couldn't even hear much of it very well. Social media is how you get the message out. If you can get Elon Musk or Tucker Carlson or somebody to spread things on X or Twitter, where literally hundreds of millions can see it, and if they put it out there, they're outside British jurisdictions in terms of the courts and so forth. I think there are other ways to achieve that than going down this road. And I must say also, one of the problems is you then allow the mainstream media and politicians to spin his arrest the way that they want to, because most people don't have the time to understand why someone has gone to prison, what the exact charges are. All they are being told is, oh, this racist person has gone to jail yet again. Obviously, he's racist, and the reason he's in jail is because of some racist thing he's done, rather than the fact it was a contempt of court of playing something. And it's so easy, as we've seen, to smear people who are standing up for the rights of the British people, or standing up for the rights of young girls and so forth, to smear them as racist so easily. It's lazy to do, but the average person who doesn't have access to social media, there are only 20 million Twitter accounts in this country. Most of them aren't politically involved. Most people still consume the legacy media, and they will spin it the way that they want to spin it.
How much longer can that go on? Because, we see people like, only yesterday, Alex Phillips came out and said that she feels Tommy's wonderful. That was her words. I hope it doesn't lead to her being cancelled. But look, people like yourself, people like Alex, people are stepping forward, telling the truth. How much longer will it be before the first thing that Tommy is given the right of reply is actually allowed back on TV? As Alex said, the media were bending over to get Shamima Begum on there. But when it comes to Tommy, it's persona non grata. How much longer can they get away with this, do you think? Or will they be able to get away with it?
We can't, the legacy media are completely captured. There's absolutely no hope of having any sort of rebirth, I think, of the legacy media. The future is the new media. Legacy media is dying anyway. It's a dinosaur. Why would you want to curry your favor with the... It's just a question of time for these new platforms to outperform the legacy media. Alex Phillips, a friend of mine, she's on Talk TV. It's GB News. You've got those platforms at least, but then you've got the wider platforms of social media and channels like you, and the New Culture Forum. The number of views that we get, dwarf what Newsnight will have for an episode.
Absolutely.
A week, if you look at the news, I did a debate at Cambridge Union on my own personal channel, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Do subscribe on YouTube. 3.5 million people watch that. I couldn't imagine getting those sorts of anyone allowing that to go out even at late night on Channel 4 or ITV or BBC or whatever, given the content. So that's the future, and we just have to wait for more people to actually come onto these platforms. And it's a question really of how we spread the word. It has to be done by word of mouth. And I think the more that people can see the disaster of diversity, this myth that diversity is our greatest strength, the more people wake up to that, hopefully the more of them will discover our channels, because although we do have large numbers now, it's still tiny compared to the population of this country as a whole. And that's why, unfortunately, you still have the legacy media able to spin their tales about the benefits of immigration, about how racist Tommy Robinson is. All this can still be spun and consumed by people who actually are on our side, but they actually don't know the reality and the truth. That's why I say thank God for Elon Musk. You know, during those Southport riots, if it wasn't for X, we wouldn't have known the full story. We wouldn't have seen the gangs of Muslims rampaging through the streets. We would have bought in to the only media that we would have seen otherwise. It was Facebook and Instagram and the BBC were all showing a very slanted, very biased, very narrow view of what happened.
Let's talk about Southport for a minute. Obviously, we can't talk about the case itself, but what we can talk about is what we feel that Merseyside police knew, how early they knew it, and of course, that means how early Yvette Cooper and the Prime Minister knew what was going on. I've gone on record a couple of weeks back now, longer, as saying that I think the court case that he's coming up in January, I feel could be the end of Keir Starmer when everything is revealed, if everything is revealed. Your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad thing, but we're in an age now where the biggest scandals no longer lead to resignations. We saw that, of course, under Boris Johnson as well, right? We live in this bizarre world now where things which, 30 years ago you would have gone for are now excused. But I think if this is proven to be true, and if it's proven that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, and or the Home Secretary knew in advance of decrying the patriotic people who were concerned about the murder of 3 young girls and denounced them as thugs and far right and criminals, if they knew in advance that there was an Al-Qaeda manual and ricin at the property allegedly of this person who has been arrested and charged, and they went ahead and said the things that they said, and essentially gave the green light for the sort of action that we saw being taken, that undeniably should be grounds for the complete collapse of the government. It's absolutely indefensible, and it would be one of the most remarkable acts of modern times in politics. And it seems to me unconscionable. I mean, if you arrest somebody who has done what this person is alleged to have done, the first thing you do is you search their house, right? That happens immediately. And so this evidence must surely have come into the hands of the authorities, one would have assumed, at some very early stage. So I don't know the facts, we have to wait and see, but I can't imagine that these things weren't known by somebody in authority, whether that was only in the police or not. But the thing is, we just need to be patient. People say, it's a cover-up. Look, it's annoying because in America and other countries, you don't have this silly thing about we can't comment until we have the trials underway. And I think it was scandalous that Lindsay Hoyle also tried to silence debate in the chamber as speaker on this. But the truth will out. We just have to be patient, because I think it's in January, isn't it, that the trial starts?
January,
And yes, British justice will see this evidence put forward eventually. I'm quite confident of that. We'll see what happens then, because it has been an absolute disgrace to slander people. I mean, those people who are clearly violent and engaged in criminal activity, of course,
absolutely
should feel the force of the law. But the speed with which the decent British people who were outraged at this act were maligned and slurred as racist and thugs, I think is unconscionable. And it just goes to show the degree to which we are held in contempt by this elite who have no understanding of what life is like at the coalface of diversity, at the people whose daily lives pass seeing the sad reality of the deterioration of our local communities. From the old mill towns of the north to the heart of our capital city, people's towns and cities and communities have changed beyond all recognition, to the point where they don't even recognize them anymore. And of course, the people who rule us live in these alcoves. We know from all the evidence that the more homogenous, the more white a society is, a community is, the more open they are to immigration, and the more supportive they are of diversity, because they never get to see the daily realities that the people who are protesting and rioting do.
And of course, those comments that came after from Keir Starmer in particular, they didn't exactly help the Muslim community either, did they? Because talk of the EDL, long disbanded, talk of so-called riot dates that never materialised, that brought, some would say understandably, the Muslim community out looking to protect their own communities. And of course, there'll be many of those guys sitting in jail now today as well that perhaps needn't have been there if Keir Starmer would have thought this out a little bit better and been a little bit more, let's just say, accurate about what he was telling people. There's a lot of people that are currently in jail from both communities that will currently be at work instead going home to their families tonight.
Yeah, I mean, there was a deliberate stoking of community tensions by the left, by the government, by people like Hope Not Hate, with the ridiculous incendiary statements, completely unjustified, that were being made. And we know, of course, what part of this has all been, it was almost like some sort of beer hall putsch type scenario. We're going to create this fake scenario that there are going to be these EDL gangs marauding the streets. And then when they don't materialize, we'll say, oh, well, it was, of course, because the great British public rose up and they evaporated away, when in fact they weren't there at all. But now that, of course, has become one of the great canals and trophies that Hope Not Hate and others are spreading, that, oh, well, we saw down these evil rioters and so forth, which, of course, is a complete nonsense.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is all of this would have been so avoidable if Keir Starmer and the government simply listened and did what the British people want. You're now seeing on the continent of Europe, European leaders waking up to the reality of the disastrous policies of mass immigration and diversity. I mean, let's be clear, there has been no greater act of harm in our Long Island story than mass immigration, incalculably more damaging to Britain than the cost of fighting the Second World War. And the Europeans are now waking up to that. That's why you even see Ursula von der Leyen saying they need to get stricter on border controls and on the deportations of illegal immigrants and so forth. You have the EU allowing Poland to say that it will not accept any more asylum seekers into Poland. You have Germany basically ending temporarily Schengen, saying it's going to have more enforced borders along its land borders. You have the Swedes now, the Swedish government now saying they are going to adopt a policy of voluntary remigration, another way of saying repatriation, by paying 3,000 kroners per person to return home. Unimaginable for Labour or any British politician to discuss any of that sort of stuff. That's beyond the pale in this country. Yeah. Now, I think the Overton window is shifting and those things will become discussable here within the next few years. But now you can't discuss it. But that's being discussed in Europe, and at the highest level by the EU Commission. Let me just say this: all those people on the left who, for years have told us all that here in Britain, plague Britain, we're a bunch of Neanderthal knuckle draggers, unlike the enlightened liberals in the EU. Well, I'm sorry. Now we are actually to the left of the European Union. Even Nigel Farage is to the left of many mainstream leaders in Europe.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, look, politically, I mean, let's talk about Trump, Elon Musk, Reform, Nigel Farage. I mean, look, where do they all fit into this picture? Because I'm not sure. We talk about potential deportations. I don't see that politically here in the UK right now. I don't see anyone that's going to take that on, including Nigel Farage. So where is it going to come from? Will Trump have some kind of influence on Nigel along the line? Will he push him to be a little bit more bolder and perhaps a little bit more hardline? I don't know. What's your view on that?
Well, the remarkable thing was that Robert Jenrick was talking along these lines, and he was outflanked. I mean, Robert Jenrick's whole game plan, that if your viewers are from overseas, Robert Jenrick was challenging Kemi Badenoch to become leader of the Conservative Party. And he was outflanking Farage. And my friend Steve Edgington from GB News, did an interview with Nigel Farage and asked him whether he would be willing to have mass deportation of the 1 million illegal immigrants here. And Nigel Farage said no. And Jenrick sort of seized upon all of that. And there was a hope that if Jenrick had become the leader of the Tories, there would be they would try to outdo each other in who could be more conservative. And that would have been one way, at least, you could have had the adoption of better, stronger, more successful approaches to tackling the issue. But look, Donald Trump has raised the whole issue of mass deportations. In fact, his new border czar that he appointed, who's a very sound chap, I don't know if you've seen this guy, he's actually now said officially, we are going to embark upon the biggest program of deportations in American history. So when you have the EU talking like this, when you have the Swiss, the Finns, and the Swedish all talking about remigration, and when you have Germany closing its borders, I think, these things take time in this country, but I think things will shift. And, it needs to be people like Nigel to move this along forward. And I would hope that, now that the Americans are talking about it, that it will become something which people here aren't ashamed or afraid to discuss.
Do you think that's Nigel's big problem at the moment? I mean, obviously, there is a problem for him. I mean, we are not the United States. We don't deal with things the way the Americans do. We are very British. Is that his biggest problem right now, a balancing act of keeping his core supporters happy and trying to attract Middle England, Tory voters, Labour voters?
That's precisely it. I think this effort to professionalize the party, I mean, I understand it, and a lot of stuff, I would do as well. But there's a fear here that by professionalizing, they are diluting and watering down the core message and the core policies. And, they must simply realize and understand that the average British voter is to the right of the average Tory MP. Not just any MP in Parliament. Conservative MPs are to the left of the British voter. So the British voter, of course, is going to embrace stronger policies on immigration. And you see that within every single age bracket as well. So even the young people, we have the most radically left-wing youth in history. We've never seen such extreme views being held by such a large portion of the population, of the young population, and they're not becoming more conservative as they get older. But when it comes to immigration, even they too can see that it's not having a positive effect on our society. And so it would be a huge betrayal, I would think, of the voters for reform and the British people more broadly if we saw a watering down of the message of reform in order to capture the sorts of voters who would vote Tory or Lib, who have basically wish-washed between Lib Dem and Tory. That's not how you are going to have a true restoration of British sovereignty and a fight back for those things that we hold dear.
Do you think we might see a change in Farage's rhetoric when Trump takes over in January?
I think the fact is, of course, America sets the tone for the Anglosphere. I've always said, what people call woke, I think, is a too nice and silly and cozy a term. It's American Marxism. The history of woke is very much rooted in Marxist ideology, and it came to fruition in America through American universities. We've had all this critical race theory. So, the old adage, when America sneezes, we get a cold. America sets the tone for these sorts of discussions, and the woke mind virus was spread by the English language. That's why it's the Anglosphere nations of Canada, Britain, and Australia and the bilingual nations of Scandinavia and Denmark and in the Netherlands, which all speak English. So we just need a Trump version of that woke mind virus to come over here. Proper conservative thought, ideas, great speakers and intellectuals, charismatic figures that can coalesce around Trump and Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, and through that, hopefully, energize a new generation of people in this country to take things further. And also look to Europe, because it's, of course, in this country, the youth are so radically left-wing, but if you look over to Europe, it's young figures who are the rising stars of the right. Nigel Farage, God bless him, has been around for a long time, but we need also a team around him of young, dynamic figures. And you see that in France, you see that in Austria and Germany, and we need to have that here, because there are some encouraging news. For example, we know that more young people voted for the Reform Party than voted for the Tories in the last election. In Canada, the youth of Canada, the capital of woke with Emperor Trudeau, they've seen what paradise is like in woke countries and in a woke nation, and they're turning against it. And so huge swing to the Conservatives in Canada of young people. I think after 5 years or even 10 years of Labour rule in this country, the young people of this nation will be crying out for some common sense. So there's a huge opportunity here.
I think the one thing that the younger generation would certainly miss is freedom and freedom of speech, and I think they better learn the lesson now rather than later. I mean, we're currently fighting their battle for them, if only they knew it.
Well, this is the greatest tragedy. I mean, a generation in this country that regards themselves as being the most tolerant of all is actually the least tolerant, and scarily so, because more young people in Britain today believe that protecting minorities from offence or stopping offence is more important than free speech. The importance of free speech has never been at greater risk than it is now. We see this even from our political class wanting to shut down Twitter and so forth, and put people like Elon Musk in prison. And a lot of this is because, of course, our teaching profession has been taken over by the left. When we were at school, you used to have a pretty even balance. In fact, if anything, might have lent slightly to the right in schools, judging by the number of things thrown at my head when I was a young guy. Now it's over 90% of teachers vote for left-wing parties. At universities, for example, only 4% of historians at Harvard are actually right-wing. 96% are left-wing. So they've come through this completely indoctrinated. But we need to have a new curriculum in our school. This is what Heydel and Reform should be talking about, where you learn about the evolution of our democracy, on the hard struggle to get the right to vote and to get free speech in this country, and also to teach them the dangers of losing that. So referencing to the communist world, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the horrors of what happens when you lose your fundamental freedoms, including the right to free speech, because our young take them too cavalierly.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Rafe, I could keep you all day here, but I just want to ask you one more question before I let you go. Liz Truss said last week, we're up against the potential end of Western civilization if we don't fight back against this ideology. Then earlier this week, or was it the tail end of last week, 300 young men with unknown backgrounds, and I would imagine without any criminal checks whatsoever, were literally dropped into a town like Altrincham. Now, I don't know Altrincham particularly well, but I know it's quite a nice area. And that, for me, there was almost like a little bit of a tipping point there. I'm thinking, you know what? If these people don't get this yet, they're going to get it now. How can you drop 300 young men into a town like Altrincham and possibly hope that it ends well? 200 yards, I believe, from the local girls' school. How can that possibly end well in anyone's mind?
Well, it can't. And, I have a great many issues with Liz Truss, not least despite claiming to be a conservative. She wanted to increase immigration when she was prime minister. Never let her escape that. But this is a struggle for Western civilization, and there's no other way to put it. And quite frankly, we have imported willingly into this nation, well, our government has imported willingly into this nation, a fifth column, an army of young men of fighting age who now run the length and breadth of this country, and contrast them with the Ukrainian refugees, women, children, the elderly, and the frail and infirm. The people coming here are not asylum seekers. There is no reason for them to be here. They need to be deported immediately. They need to be emptied from the hotels and from the subsidized housing, which they have taken at the expense of British people on housing waiting lists. They need to be put into temporary refugee camps before they are deported. I've said for a long time, I mean, look, my grandmother's cousins came here from Poland, and they couldn't go back to Poland after the Second World War because it was communist. They'd been put in prison. They were housed in refugee camps. And in fact, my aunt got married to somebody in a refugee camp. They were there for years. It was fine for them, and they were young girls when they were there. Our British Armed Forces, who are the same age as these chaps, they spend time living in camps. Why we have to put them up into hotels and luxury accommodation, I don't understand. The solution here I've put forward for many years is you simply need to get old cruise ships in the Channel. You pick up these chaps, you put them into these old cruise ships that they never set foot on British soil. When the cruise ships are full up, you send them to one of the British overseas territories. That way you don't have any of the legal issues you had with Rwanda and so forth. You process them on the Ascension Islands, And I tell you, once you've got a few boatloads going to a windswept island in the ocean, the deterrence will be far stronger than anything anyone else has ever seen. It's not impossible to do. That's precisely what the Australians did with the island of Nauru, which was exactly the same concept. Nauru is 1,000 miles off the coast of Australia. I debated this with Jacob Rees-Mogg twice. He said, oh, the civil service told us it's impossible. I said, Jacob, why are you listening to the civil service? They're another fifth column. I mean, they're working actively to obstruct the government. You know, the British Civil Service Home Office have an approval rating of 74% of asylum seekers. That was twice the French level at one point recently. I think it's still the highest in Europe. I've long called for an end. Well, firstly, we need to get rid of the Human Rights Act, as I said before, get rid of the Equalities Act. We need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. You get all of these do-gooders who say, oh, but look, only Russia and Belarus are not in the European Convention of Human Rights. Do you want to join those ranks? To which I say, actually, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand aren't in the European Convention on Human Rights. No one is accusing them of being human rights abusers. We had rights long before we joined any of these things, long before Tony Blair's legislation came into effect as well. What we also need to do is we need to have a serious discussion globally about the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, and we need to abolish it because that was created for a post-World War II world. Everyone was thinking about how do we resettle the Jews within Europe, how do we settle the Eastern Europeans who can't go back to the communist world? Nobody foresaw the huge movement of people across the world. And what we need to do is we need to replace it with a new convention that says refugees and asylum seekers will be rehoused within their continent of origin. So if you are fleeing Sudan, you go somewhere else in Africa. If you're fleeing Syria, you go somewhere else in the Middle East. If you're fleeing Ukraine, you come within Europe, because it's our culture and our religion that define how easy it is to assimilate and integrate and settle. And so we need to ensure that people remain in cultures where they can easily get along with each other.
Yeah, and they're compatible. It's a great point. Lastly, this is the last one, I promise you. Any political ambitions for Rafe?
None at all. Firstly, nobody would have me. I think I'm a bit too outspoken and frank in my discussions. I also could never toe the party line. And I hate that about politics, where you have to go and defend something you don't agree with. And I would never be able to do that. So.
I think you might be missing a trick, and we might be missing a good potential MP. But Rafe,
always happy to be appointed to the House of Lords.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Paul. Keep up the good work. Take care.
Thank you very much.